Hello, this is Mr. Fiction 1, and today I'll be talking about something that, for some reason, I couldn't find any YouTube videos or even articles on: the history of furry fiction. Now, let me repeat myself for clarification. I said the history of furry fiction, not the furry fandom. For whatever reason, the internet is filled with various videos and articles detailing the history of the fandom, but not the evolution of the fiction itself. Before I launch into the history of furry fandom, I need to quickly establish what I mean by furry fiction. On the surface, furry appears to be not a genre, but merely a quasi-trope that transcends genre itself, which at minimum, all it takes for a work of fiction to be classified as furry is to have at least one anthropomorphic character, even if behaviorally that character is the same as being a human. However, having experience in the fandom and the fiction, I can say the furry phenomenon sometimes acts like a genre. Some reoccurring tropes I've encountered over the years with fiction involving furries would be tropes like what it means to be human, human and animalistic traits in an anthro character, speciesism, human versus anthro conflict as an allegory for human rights, or perhaps interspecies conflict between other species, an anthro character in a human world being an allegory for being different, or vice versa, and alienation from one's own humanity. So with that being established, I think it's safe to say that furry can act like a genre, and as we will see, can be thought of as having innovations and milestones within it, just like the genre of science fiction or rock music. So where did it all begin? Well, many researchers usually say that the furry fandom started in the 1970s in the underground comic scene, but this is not where furry fiction originated. Where it all began is difficult to say. Around the world, many spirits and gods have been portrayed as human-animal hybrids, such as Anubis, the dog-headed god of death, or the Hanuman, a Hindu monkey god. Aesop's fables from ancient Greece depict talking animals as well, and several medieval European texts speak of the dog-headed men, or cynocephaly, who have also tended to have in numerous times been seen around the world. But perhaps the absolute oldest example of furry fiction in recorded history is an essay written on clay tablets that has been entitled A Debate Between a Bird and a Fish, which is dated around 2100 BC. The literature is philosophical in nature and is similar to other works of the era that feature debates between non-human things that deal with themes of humanity's place in the universe, from the perspective of birds and fish in this case. Western fairy tales as well as nursery rhymes that featured anthropomorphic talking animals. I've never really understood why this was, except for the fact that over the centuries, Aesop's fables became adopted for children in order to teach them moral lessons. And I guess the fact that emotions and expressions are sort of easier to read in anthro animals, I don't know, I know that it looks fun too. The 19th century featured some anthropomorphic animals too, in political cartoons, as well as many novels such as Through the Looking Glass, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, The Jungle Book, and The Island of Dr. Moreau, not to even mention the works of Beatrix Potter. And these works, minus The Island of Dr. Moreau, further established furry fiction's reputation as being only for children. It should be noted that during the first half of the 20th century, some furry fiction was made that was aimed at adults. One such example is the fiction of Austro-Hungarian author Felix Salten, who wrote many stories that feature talking animals, as well as a novel that feature a man being turned into a dog that eventually inspired the Disney film The Shaggy Dog. He was also actually the author of Bambi, yes, the novel that was adapted into the well-known Disney film with the same name. Apparently it was intended as a parable for Jewish persecution in Europe, and in case you didn't know, which is pretty dark. Another important example of 20th century furry fiction is George Orwell's Animal Farm, which some consider to be the very first furry novel universally recognized as being exclusively for adults. I guess the Metamorphosis didn't count because it's about a bug and wasn't as well known, I don't know. Anyway, anthropomorphic animals were still much more associated with children's entertainment by mid-century. This association with family and children's entertainment actually led to the creation of the funny animal cartoon. Because of the expense of animation, you see, almost out of necessity, animation was aimed at families and children for the largest financial returns. Obvious examples of these children's funny animal cartoons would be the Mickey Mouse shorts of the 1930s and the contemporaneous Looney Tunes cartoons. It should also be noted that the phrase funny animal, which was used to describe such cartoons at the time, was also generally used to describe anthropomorphic cartoon animals before the term furry was started to be used around the 1980s. While this was all going on, another significant mid-century development happened. In 1950, C.S. Lewis published The Chronicles of Narnia, which, while it was still working at children, re-established anthropomorphic animals in their original mythic context. It was a fantasy novel where anthropomorphic talking animals acted seriously and appeared alongside mythic creatures such as fauns and dryads. They were nothing like the funny animals of Disney and Looney Tunes that were popular at the time, that's for sure. These answers had families and lives and didn't spend the day failing to make roadrunner traps or beating the snot out of each other. Although we might not think of it today, Lewis made a profound contribution to furry fiction that can be still seen clearly today in fantasy fiction involving anthropomorphic animals. Arguably, the classic funny animal era died around the late 1960s. By 1966, Walt Disney had died, and 3 years later, the Merry Melodies cartoons, where the Looney Tunes made their first appearance, ended production. With the decade now over and a more countercultural feel in the air, what might have made furry fiction in the 1970s among a more untraditional young baby boomer generation? Now, many know that the furry fandom has its roots in the underground comics movement. But what exactly is this movement? Well, the movement was about independent comics made by hippies and other nonconformers starting in the late 1960s that didn't have to abide by the censorship standards of the American Comics Code Authority, a now defunct censorship regulation board. Now, a lot of these types of comics were not unprecedented. Things called Tijuana Bibles, which were pornographic parodies of well-known comics and cartoons, were known to exist as far back as the 1920s. These comics included adult parodies of funny animal cartoons like Mickey Mouse. To us who only know censored fiction from that era, these comics seem very shocking, especially since they go back at least 100 years. It's possible that studio animators were also involved in making of these comics, especially in light of the rumor that there are thousands of adult versions of classic Disney characters kept in Disney archives somewhere. But as for these underground comics, much of their content was explicit too, but they also dealt with serious themes related to countercultural topics such as drugs or the Vietnam War. Aside from the possible creation of the furry fandom in terms of explicit content aimed for adults anyway, the movement also created the fabulous Freak Brothers, now a cartoon on Tubi, and is possibly the origin of the phrases "keep on trucking" and "couch potato." One such underground artist, Robert Crumb, had created a funny animal cartoon in 1965 named Fritz the Cat for Help magazine. Although the creation of the comic predates the underground comics movement as a whole, the comic was a hit with countercultural artists, and in 1972, the comic was given the movie adaptation treatment by artist and animator Ralph Bakshi. The film was not only Bakshi's debut film, but also became the first animated film to be given an X rating, which is sort of equivalent to an NC-17 rating today. Bakshi would go on to make Coonskin, another ultra-controversial animated film featuring anthropomorphic animals, but would never make a film entirely made up of anthropomorphic animals. Bakshi's film, as well as the underground movement, eventually led to the creation of Vooty, an underground comics/magazine entirely dedicated to stories about funny animals for adults. Ultimately, it was almost like an adult parody of the funny animals cartoon the baby boomers grew up with. The magazine was somewhat popular, and one of these comic strips, Omaha the Exotic Cat Dancer, which contained explicit scenes, although not for shock value, which made it a milestone in both comics and furry fiction. Eventually became its own standalone comic around, I think, the early 1980s, and was eventually nominated for several Eisner Awards. Now, before we leave the decade, we should talk about a piece of furry fiction that doesn't quite get enough attention, the 1972 novel Watership Down. I'm not sure how truly innovative the novel is in terms of firsts, but I can't think of a novel that existed before it that created entire mythology, language, and society culture for a real-world animal species. The world building is quite impressive, and probably the most pretentious kind found in furry fiction up to that point. I seriously suggest you read the novel just to check out how the author gave the rabbits a perfect mix between human-like qualities and animal-like qualities. I also suggest reading the novel to experience the fictional language of Lapine language, an entire fictional language created just for the book. Anyway, the 1970s came to a close with much hope for great furry fiction in the future. Due to the success of Vooty and works like Watership Down, contributors to the genre began to meet together at conventions at the end of the decade. This led to a lot of what would happen next decade. Quite early in the decade, the word furry was coined to describe anthropomorphic animals in serious situations, to distinguish them from funny animals. It was possibly first used at the 1980 Northeast Cons 2 World Science Fiction Convention in Boston to describe art from what would eventually become the comic Albedo Anthropomorphics. This led to a discussion group for the concept and eventually was adopted as a formal name for the genre as well as a fandom. Albedo got its standalone comic in 1983. The comic was drawn and written by one Steve Galacci, who was not trained as a furry artist but rather as a technical illustrator for the United States Air Force. His comic is an example of a quality work of fiction featuring thought-out fictional sci-fi vehicles made with knowledge of real-world military vehicles. The comic ran for 20 years. Albedo was also remembered for another reason, being the comic where the now famous Usagi Yojimbo first premiered. The series is by Japan-born artist Stan Yokai and features an anthropomorphic rabbit who lives as a ronin walking warrior's pilgrimage in Edo-era Japan. The series is still ongoing and as of 2016 clocked in around 200 issues. The series also has been awarded 5 Eisner Awards and has received 20 nominations. Another significant development happened with furry fiction in 1984, but it's not as well known. In 1984, Osamu Tezuka, guess that Tezuka, the Godfather manga, released Baji, the Mighty Monster of Nature. At the time, this film was made as a protest against the Japanese government approval of recombinant DNA research that year. Unlike earlier anime that featured talking animals such as Kimba the White Lion, the OVA featured furries that were bipedal or walked on 2 legs, and had more human appearance. This is perhaps the very first anime in that sense. Who knew this thing would be the grandfather beast of us? Oh, also, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles came in 1984, but does that count as furry or scaly work? A little talk about milestone furry fiction also occurred in the 1980s. It can be hard to believe today, but as far back as 1986, before the internet truly existed and became what it is now and looked like this, the very first furry webcomic came out. The early comic looked something like this, and interestingly was possibly the second webcomic made ever, with the semi-lost webcomic known as Witches and Stitches being the first. For all you furry artists out there, it's important to note that the comic was actually made on a touchpad, specifically a Koala pad, and ran on a Commodore 64. Maybe it's true what they say about furries in IT. One final important part of furry fiction I need to talk about before we leave the 1980s, and that's fanzines. Now, before social media, fandoms shared ideas, stories, and art, but through these fan magazines instead of the internet. Brow Brazzle was one of the earlier ones, actually being successor to the original Voodoo magazine. It was the first APA or Amateur Press Association magazine for furries, which is the form of self-publishing in which all of the members of an association submit multiple copies of printed material to a central person. The 1980s in particular, probably because of the success of Voodoo/Brow Brazzle, spawned many fanzines such as Bestiary, Morse, Huzzah, Critters, and Perversion. Okay, enough said about the last one, the better. Now, the 1990s started off strong when, in 1991, Tales of the Taipan Universe first came out. It was the first shared universe furry magazine. It featured sci-fi furry stories and eventually showcased mystery and romance stories. Although many of the artists and writers who were involved in the comic may be forgotten, it was the first gig for many furry content creators, and the zine even won 2 Ursa Major Awards in 2003 and 2004. The same year also saw the release of the Ren and Stimpy show. The show, although on the surface just seems to be about 2 cartoon animals living together and acting out absurdist and slapstick humor in various roles, it was actually a very influential cartoon whose legacy we can still feel 30 years later. The show not only pushed the boundaries of television censorship, as is one of the first Western kid shows to be known for being so edgy, but also seemed to popularize concepts such as extensive use of gross house humor, gross ups, which can still be seen in shows like SpongeBob, and popularized the use of retro animation in the 90s. The series was also one of the very first Nicktoons, and its critical acclaim helped usher in an era that focused away from the toy-driven IP model of the 1980s and towards creator-driven shows. In a way, shows like Ren and Stimpy began to push furry fiction into the mainstream, in the sense that they were shows about funny animals more aimed at adults than kids. Many millennial kids got their first exposure to furry fiction in the shows in the 90s, some of which would only have gone greenlit because of Ren and Stimpy's success, such as Rocko's Modern Life and maybe indirectly Animaniacs, as it contained some sly humor for adults. In a way, RNS and Rocko were 2 shows that were like the unholy fusion of classic innocent funny animal cartoons and the early 20th century, and the demented and gross creations of the early furry fanzines. These shows not only pushed the envelope with what could be shown on TV with their suggestive nature, they also stretched the limits of traditional hand-drawn animation just before its unexpected end. Not to mention they both set the standard for what a Nicktoon ought to be. In the related world of comics, the next year, 1992, saw the birth of the Sonic the Hedgehog comic series by Archie Comics. Although the writing in retrospective has not been viewed by fans as all that good, it got many millennials and later Gen Zers into the Sonic fandom, and as they got older, the furry fandom. Case in point, in 2004, I got my first Sonic comic, and the rest is history. The series should be seen as a milestone for furry fiction because not only does the comic hold the title for longest comic series based off of a video game, but also actually holds the title for longest running franchise-based comic series. After this, milestones in furry fiction were few and far between. The Disney Renaissance gave us some interesting anthro characters, but we all know that one big year was 1994. Apart from this being the year that Duckman was released, which arguably was the very first furry TV show marketed exclusively for adults, this was obviously the year The Lion King was released. The film itself is an obvious influence since it's cited by many furry millennials as being their first exposure to such fiction. However, 1994 was also the release year for the lesser known and far darker German film Philadelphia. Furry was a milestone for two reasons. First, it was the most expensive animation project from Germany at the time. The second reason was that, as far as I know, the film was the very first rated R furry drama film, and I'm not counting Fritz the Cat because it was a comedy and pornography. As for the film itself, without spoiling it, it contains a very disturbing plot that features grisly cat murders that act as an allegory for the Holocaust. Although the film was not received very well when it first came out, and still isn't well known, its influence on furry fiction can be clearly seen. The century began with furry fiction merely being found in newspaper comics and dime novels, and not being taken seriously, to being big-budgeted major motion pictures. However, furry fiction was still mostly unknown by century's end. It remained the hobby of those on the early primitive internet and convention-goers. However, as the furry fandom and furry fiction grew on the internet and at those early conventions, more milestones in the genre would follow, and more mainstream success would be found in the 21st century.
At first glance, the first decade of the 21st century doesn't seem to have much to offer. Obviously, not much can top the 80s with its list of fandom and fiction firsts. However, despite the decade being known for the start of the still ongoing War of Terror and all the fear it caused, the 2000s saw the introduction of 30 new conventions in contrast to only 13 new conventions in the 90s. As the fandom grew, the fiction also still managed to achieve several milestones in the 2000s. Now, the first mainstream furry video game was obviously 1991's Sonic the Hedgehog, even though, to be fair, certain games with furry protagonists preceded Sonic, such as 1983's arcade classic Mappy. However, the first furry video game exclusively aimed at adults is largely forgotten today. That milestone would go to Conker's Bad Fur Day. Released on March 5th, 2001 in North America, the game could be described as a shock comedy parody of popular platformer games at the time such as Super Mario 64 and Crash Bandicoot. What many don't know is that the game is a sequel to the 1999 rated E Conker's Pocket Tales. Originally, Conker wasn't an adult game. However, as development went on, the market quickly saturated as Mario 64 clones dominated the platformer market. Eventually, an artist employed with Rare, Chris Seavor, who had an idea for a game called Bad Fur Day that featured Conker trying to help others but causing more problems doing so as well. He also wanted the game to be, quote, edgy in terms of violence. As the writing progressed, the game took on elements that were common to adult animation at the time, such as sexual humor and reference-based humor that played off of the Gen X pop culture imagination, such as references to Star Wars, Apocalypse Now, and Jaws. It ultimately was reviewed well but sold poorly. Now, the second big 2000s furry fiction milestone was a more ignorable one than Conker's Bad Fur Day, if you can believe it being the very first that I can tell fictional TV show to portray the furry fandom. Yes, CSI's infamous 2003 episode Fur and Loathing. I'll try to spare most of the grisly details and try to focus more on the fandom reaction / involvement. So, in summary, the episode is about the murder of a male furry who fursuits as a raccoon persona in Las Vegas. Obviously, the thing that everyone remembers about this is the fact that the fictional furry convention in the episode was portrayed as little more than being about public sex and lectures. Although, to be fair, there has been documented public sexual stuff at furry conventions for a bit. Obviously, being a part of the furry fandom is much more than sexual activities, as there are even furries who claim to be completely non-sexual. Of course, the furry fandom at large showed disapproval at their portrayal of the fandom, especially in light of being told by a somewhat famous fur, Dark Fox, aka Saber Fox, what happened when he was hired as a consultant of sorts. In short, Dark Fox was hired to invite local furries to be extras in the episode as well as review the script, but after noticing that many extreme sexual aspects of the fandom were highlighted, which he thinks was sourced from an MTV show called Sex 2K, which had a furry episode, as well as many errors and misconceptions. In the end, Dark Fox's suggestions fell on deaf ears and the episode we know today was born. In the end, fan reaction of the episode was obviously negative and has a legacy of giving furries a bad name, which can be compared to the negative reputation that the 1982 film Mazes and Monsters gave to Dungeons & Dragons players. A somewhat famous furry, Ursula Vernon, commented at the time, quote, "I really don't blame the show for taking the weirdest possible angle, because if I were writing the show, I'd do it too. Why? Because a bunch of weirdos in costumes writhing around to porno music is way better for the ratings than an hour of slightly geeky people in t-shirts with wolves on them arguing about whether The Lion King was a better movie than Watership Down. Ultimately, I think the episode is best forgotten." Lastly, the third big milestone that many tend to forget that occurred during the 2000s was the slew of webcomics that came out. Seriously, name your favorite furry webcomic and it probably originated in the 2000s. House Pets, Lackadaisy Cats, Two Kinds, Circles, and other famous comics I probably forgot started then. A lot of this has to do with the explosion of internet usage as well as digital art tablet usage in the 2000s, but also probably in the rise of home video, making furry cartoons available to all ages. After that, yeah, not too much happened in the 2000s in terms of historically important furry fiction. Fandom-wise, both furaffinity.net, which I believe is still the largest social furry art gallery on the web, and WikiFur launched in 2005. I mean, something somewhat notable is in 2009, Wes Anderson's Fantastic Mr. Fox dropped, arguably being, if one doesn't count the 1978 adaptation of Watership Down, and the 1982 adaptation of The Plague Dogs, the first furry art house film. Now, why is it an art house film, you might ask? Well, besides the fact that it's made by Wes Anderson and that his films are considered art because of their highly stylized look, I mean, just look at how Mr. Fox looks. Pretty much everywhere throughout the movie. How's this not art? Anyway, besides the aforementioned briefly stated, the film is a serious example of one Fox's midlife crisis as well as relationship with his family. It's very well done, and I highly recommend watching it, as well as Cardinal West's analysis video for it, giving thanks for Fantastic Mr. Fox. Anyway, in conclusion, the 2000s came to a close with a recession, and with it, less of a chance of seeing films like Fantastic Mr. Fox and seeing films more like Iron Man due to the franchise tentpoles being less of a financial risk. However, much great furry fiction was around the corner. Now, anyone who remembers the early 2010s and was on the internet at the time, especially if you're Gen Z or Millennial, remembers the rise of the Brony fandom. For those who don't know, the fandom is identified as being the adult fandom of the children's show My Little Pony: Friendship is Magic, which first aired on The Hub, a successor to the Discovery Kids channel in the US. Initially, adult interest in the show was among hipsters who watched the show ironically, since the franchise was seen as something just to sell toys, but as more adults watched it, interest online spiked, especially due to the sites like Equestria Daily, which started in January of 2011. The show ran itself for a total of 9 entire seasons, from 2010 to 2019, and gathered quite a following. I remember reading somewhere back in the 2010s, I think it was on TV Tropes, that at a certain point the show had more fan art for it than Marvel and Star Wars combined or something insane like that. Also, the fandom had massive fan labor to its name, such as voice-acted 9-hour Ace Attorney and My Little Pony crossover video series, Fallout Equestria, which was a massive fanfic, which can be described as a mini-fandom of its own, with many side stories and sequels and derivative works, and numerous fan animations and fan music I'm not even going to go into. Lastly, many celebrities identify themselves as bronies over the run of the show, such as William Shatner, who starred in the show, Andrew W.K., Broadway actress Lena Hall, and even Gabe Newell identified as bronies. So, in other words, Friendship is Magic and bronies were a very big deal. I even remember hearing statistics somewhere that at the height of the show, something like every 1 in 20 people in the world was a brony, which is amazing. However, as the show went on, many became bored with it, and with their newfound interest in anthropological fiction, decided to go into fandoms that feature furry characters. Because of their access to the internet and their intimate knowledge of how to use it, it wasn't long before they discovered franchises like Five Nights at Freddy's, Undertale, Zootopia, and even Hazbin Hotel. And although many of these people are still part of these fandoms, many people have recognized through their choice of the aforementioned fandoms and other works of fiction that they have a perennial interest in fiction that features anthropomorphic animals. Later in the 2010s, many would discover furries through apps such as TikTok, but for me, it was doing wiki hopping and exploring fan art on sites like Pinterest and DeviantArt. However, it can be safely said that of all these works of fiction that transitioned people best from furries to bronies, Zootopia is the #1 culprit. It came at a time several years after many left the brony fandom either because they had become, like I just said, bored of the series or disillusioned from both the letting go of the creator, Lauren Faust, the show becoming more marketed at its target demographic of little girls with the induction of Equestria Girls and the concept of Princess Twilight. The film also came around the time that the Undertale fandom was slightly dying down 1 year after its release, so really its timing could not have been more perfect. As for the film itself, as of the writing of the script, July 2022, at grossing over $1 billion, it ended up becoming the second highest grossing original film ever, as it is not a sequel, prequel, reboot, nor an adaptation of any fictional work. The film is also Disney's second longest film, clocking at 108 minutes, with Fantasia being their longest film. The film is also a historical milestone in its use of animation. The film probably has a record for most characters in a CGI movie. There are about 400 unique species and costume setups in Zootopia, with over 800,000 unique potential characters in total. The film, I'm pretty certain, also has a record for most hairs animated in a CGI film, with just one mouse character having more hair than Elsa in Frozen. In fact, several new software programs were created to animate the film, such as iGroom, which helps digitally brush the fur in the film, as well as a program I couldn't find the name for that controls wind in ways that have never been done before that film came out. One last interesting thing about Zootopia is that it's possibly the first furry movie to be advertised to, well, furries. According to a 2016 BuzzFeed article, one example of this include a marketing agency working with Disney to send messages to, quote, furry meetup group Fur Life, encouraging furries to post photos of themselves in fursuits to Twitter and Instagram with the movie hashtag. There's also the theory that the movie has built-in marketing for furries throughout the film.
Hey, no kiss, bye-bye for daddy?
Yeah, probably just a string of coincidences, yeah. Anyway, as for anything else in the 2010s, the Sonic Archie series concluded in 2017, and one of my favorite video games of all time, Major Minor, came out in 2015, which is definitely a furry game, as you can see. Oh, and before I conclude talking about this decade, it's important to note there was a furry anime explosion after Zootopia was released. Sure, there was some furry anime before Beastars, but that was few and far between, like Wolf's Rain and Egret Soko, which was conceived before Zootopia was released and released alongside Zootopia. However, in September 2016, months after Zootopia was released, a manga by Paru Itagaki was released about a high school of anthropomorphic animals that dealt with a conflict between carnivores and herbivores. Its anime adaptation, which released in 2019 Netflix, seemed to be the anime that ignited the anime furry revolution, which can still be seen in this decade with the release of furry anime such as BNA, Brand New Animal, and Odd Taxi. All in all, the 2010s was just a great time to be or become a furry because it's arguably when the fandom and fiction became mainstream because of all the aforementioned works of fiction. I also feel that the rise of the anime fandom really helped to make furries mainstream, so there's so much crossover. This was also the time that millennial furries who grew up on the Disney Renaissance came of age and were able to make their own stuff. However, despite the challenges and tragedies of the next decade, the furry fandom would press on. So, despite the severe economic and social impact of a severe lockdown dominating the identity of the decade, as well as several other crises, the 2020s have been surprisingly fruitful in their output of furry fiction. Obviously, one of the sole mainstream hits has been The Bad Guys, which is DreamWorks' reimagining of the heist genre with anthro characters. I found the film's plot and characters to be well written, and I love the animation. Beyond this, as much as I love it, it's not really a historical film apart from the fact it was arguably the first American post-lockdown animated blockbuster, and the fact it has the longest one-shot in DreamWorks animation history at 2 minutes 25 seconds and at 7 frame rates. But as for the indie stuff, as much as the comics have been performing well, I have noticed that in particular there have been an explosion in the development of furry games. There are a lot of excellent looking indie furry games that are being released later this decade, such as Mars Vice, Brock the Investigator, Mercury Abbey, Billy Bustup, and Como Remby. In fact, as of the writing of the script, Rick Griffin, the creator of House Pets, is working on an indie game, while a furry-ish game called Stray is selling well and trending on the internet. So yeah, there's furry games everywhere. With 8 years left in the decade, and so much creative output despite the fact that the world pretty much came apart in almost every way in the last 2 years, it's a safe bet to say that things will remain creative. Given the fact that most of Gen Z as a whole remains young, unmarried, and ambitious, the fact that they can use the internet so well and use it so often, and have all these great works of furry fiction to experience almost instantly and at low prices, the 2020s could just be a furry fiction golden age. But as for now, all we have to do is relax and enjoy the show. Furry fiction went from being the subject of extremely simple stories and mythology to being the subject of computer-generated films that constantly push the envelope to see what's technologically possible. It went from being an offshoot counterculture to being a countercultural subculture. Really, the only question for furry fiction is where to next. I see so much philosophical potential in the pseudo-genre, especially questions related to bioethics, what it means to be human, identity, and more. Some of the potential of genres like cyberpunk and biopunk. We might never get a furry Hamlet or Dune, but as I've explained that Gen Z is far more active in furryism, we could definitely continue to get great stories. One direction I'd like to see furry fiction to go is that of mainstream popularity. I want to see something mainstream cool. Furry fiction 2022, the year of me writing this, beyond its reputation for perversion, it's decidedly square. Maybe a statistically higher concentration of people who are autistic in the fandom, and I say that as a person diagnosed with ASD, But furry fiction is still seen by normies that exists outside of it as a constant source of cringe content, especially on sites like 4chan, Kiwi Farms, and even YouTube. I mean, besides, how many furry rappers can you name? How about furry celebrities? See what I mean? Really, the more people interested in furry fiction means more people interested in making furry fiction, and in turn, they'll give us more great furry fiction. After all, with the furry fandom being known as a group of super creative DIYers for producing great indie content in the age of the internet, really the sky's the limit. As I had to skip a good bit of detail, even with the biggest milestones of furry fiction for the sake of time, including with stuff I forgot to say, like the fact that The Reason Why Mouse, the graphic novel about the Holocaust with different ethnicities and nationalities represented by different species, is so famous because it's the only piece of anthrofiction so far to win the Pulitzer Prize. I also skipped over entire eras of time, such as the medieval era, particularly because I didn't know that there were famous examples of anthrofiction there, the Tales of Reynard the Fox, which are quite complex and well written. However, 2 videos were enough to get one interested and to let the public know that furry fiction is worth exploring, even if you don't call yourself a furry. I mean, Mouse is assigned reading in some classrooms, and works such as Wes Anderson's Fantastic Mr. Fox received advanced critical analysis. It doesn't deserve the genre ghetto it's now in, any more than science fiction deserved its ghetto before works like Dune came out. And hopefully one day, furry fiction will receive hard-won mainstream attention and coolness once it has its own Dune. Until then, I'm Mr. Fiction 1, and I'm glad I told the world about the history of furry fiction.